Um, Imagine you wake up in August of 2026. You check your phone, and, well, the stock market is down like 20%.
Yeah, that's a rough morning.
Right. And global inflation is nearing 8%, which
Yeah.
means, your grocery bill just took another massive leap. But the real shock is when you drive to the store.
Assuming you can even drive there.
Exactly, because the diesel required to deliver that food is, well, it's physically being rationed by the government. The shelves are patchy. Amazon deliveries are taking weeks instead of days. And, this isn't science fiction.
No, it's really not.
Today, we're looking at a fascinating economic modeling report from Oxford Economics. It maps out the exact, highly fragile mathematical triggers that could, make this our reality in less than 2 years. Our mission today for this deep dive is to understand how a specific geopolitical shock could physically break the global supply chain.
Yeah, and we need to be very clear up front for everyone listening. The scenario this model explores, it involves a prolonged conflict in the Middle East, specifically drawing in the U.S., Israel, and Iran.
Right, which is an incredibly charged, deeply complex geopolitical reality.
Exactly. So our focus today is absolutely not to weigh in on the politics or endorse any foreign policy viewpoints or take any sides. We are treating this report purely as an exercise in, economic plumbing.
Economic plumbing, just the math.
Right, just the math. We want to understand the objective modeling of what happens to the global economy if certain physical choke points are closed off.
Which is an important baseline to set because the physical choke points they model are severe. The Oxford Economics team, they assess a scenario where a localized stalemate leads to the Strait of Hormuz being effectively shut down for 6 months.
Wow.
Yeah, and for context, that strait is the primary artery for the world's energy.
The main vein, basically.
Right. But the model doesn't stop there. It assumes the shock is compounded by strikes on alternative pipeline routes, the ones running through Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Plus, a heavy resurgence of Houthi attacks in the Red Sea.
Exactly. So the main artery is clamped shut, and the bypasses are simultaneously compromised. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to look at the raw physical math before we even touch the financial markets.
Oh, absolutely. The physical math is staggering.
The report estimates this scenario pulls nearly 20 million barrels of oil per day off the global market.
Which represents almost 20% of total global supply.
It's vanishing overnight.
Yes.
And, imagine crimping a garden hose by 20% on the hottest day of the year. The pressure in the rest of the system just goes crazy.
That's a great way to put it, because to truly understand a shock that size, we have to discard the idea that the global economy just slows down proportionally.
Yeah, it's not a gentle deceleration.
Not at all. It's more like draining 20% of the lubricating oil out of a heavy-duty engine. The engine doesn't just run 20% slower.
The internal friction skyrockets.
Exactly. The metal components start grinding against each other, the heat builds up uncontrollably, and very quickly the entire machine threatens to seize up completely.
I love that engine analogy because it explains the resulting panic.
Yeah.
If the engine is grinding, you scramble for whatever lubricant you have left in the garage.
Which, in the global economy, is our commercial oil inventory.
Right. And the model projects that those global commercial inventories would literally halve by the middle of 2026.
Half. Just gone.
Yeah. And then they hit critically low redline levels just 3 months later. So when supply falls off a cliff, but people still need to, heat their homes and power their factories, the price mechanism just goes haywire.
It completely detaches from reality.
We are looking at Brent crude surging to around $190 per barrel by August 2026.
At $190 a barrel, that shatters historical precedent.
Really? How high did it get before?
Well, during the massive global energy crisis in 2008, crude peaked at $147.
Oh, wow.
So we are talking about blowing $40 past the highest ceiling the modern global economy has ever experienced.
But, crude oil is practically useless until you refine it, right? You can't put crude into a Boeing 777 or a Honda Civic.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is that the refined products, the actual functional fuels that perform work in the economy, they experience an even more violent price spike than the raw crude.
So we're talking about diesel, jet fuel, maritime shipping fuel.
Yes, the costs for those just explode. And on top of that, the spillover effect hits the natural gas markets, too.
Oh, man.
The report models European and Asian natural gas prices rocketing to $30 per MMBtu in the third quarter of the year.
Wait, let's ground that number for a second. When you say $30 per MMBtu, which is a million British thermal units, the standard measure for heat energy.
Right.
How bad is that for a standard utility company
Yeah.
or just a homeowner?
It is devastating. For context, a normal, historically stable price for natural gas in the U.S. often hovers between $2 and $3.
So $30 a wow.
Yeah, even in Europe, before recent crises, $4 to $5 was standard. So hitting $30 is essentially a 6x to 10x explosion in the core cost of generating electricity and heating buildings.
And hitting that specific price point in the third quarter, that's a logistical nightmare, isn't it?
It is precisely when countries are supposed to be buying surplus gas to pump into underground storage for the winter.
So they're forced to buy at historical premiums.
Right, meaning the cost of simply keeping citizens from freezing to death drains massive amounts of capital away from the rest of the economy.
Which brings us to a massive disconnect in how we usually talk about energy. When the news covers an oil spike, your immediate thought is usually, well, my commute to the office is going to cost an extra $20 a week.
Right, we view it through the lens of personal inconvenience.
Exactly. But a 20% global supply drop isn't about the fuel in your sedan. Two-thirds of global oil consumption is tied directly to transport in industry.
It's the commercial stuff.
Right, the real backbone of this crisis is diesel.
Diesel is the physical muscle of the global supply chain. I mean, it powers the cargo ships bringing electronics across the Pacific,
It powers the freight trains moving lumber.
and the 18-wheelers delivering produce to your local grocery store, plus the heavy tractors required to harvest that produce in the first place.
Okay, I have to admit some skepticism here, though. I remember the energy shocks of the 1970s, and I remember the $147 barrel in 2008.
Sure.
The economy took a heavy beating, absolutely. But we didn't see an apocalyptic halt to society. Goods still moved. So why is this Oxford economics model pointing to an outcome so much more catastrophic?
Well, the mechanism at play in those historical examples was primarily demand destruction.
Demand destruction, meaning what exactly?
When prices hit $147 a barrel in 2008, gasoline became so expensive that people voluntarily changed their behavior to save money. Families canceled their summer road trips.
Airlines grounded inefficient planes.
Exactly. That voluntary drop in demand eventually met the lower supply and the market balanced out. The cure for high prices was high prices.
So people chose to buy less because it hurt their wallets. But you're saying this scenario is different.
Completely different. The model warns that a sudden, concentrated 20% supply shock pushes the system past demand destruction and into actual physical rationing. Meaning fuel isn't just prohibitively expensive. It literally does not exist at the local terminal. You could offer $100 a gallon and the fuel pump would still be empty.
And that physically breaks the supply chain.
Yeah.
I mean, if an Amazon logistics hub relies on 500 trucks a day, and the government is rationing diesel so they only get enough fuel for 100 trucks,
80% of those packages simply do not move.
the food begins rotting at the ports.
The factory components never arrive at the assembly line. This physical constraint bypasses the price mechanism entirely. You cannot perform the economic work, period.
Man. And that physical inability to move goods forces a violent contraction in macroeconomic growth,
It does. The report projects global inflation spiking to 7.7%.
which is nearing the peak pain we felt in 2022.
Exactly. But alongside that inflation, world GDP growth for 2026 slows to a crawl at 1.4%.
Wait, so with the global economy actually falling into outright contraction in the middle of the year?
Yes, the US, Europe, and most major advanced economies slide straight into a recession. Now, the model does project a modest recovery globally to 2.1% in 2027 as alternative supply routes are secured. But the damage inflicted in 2026 is structurally profound.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because living through a recession is one thing. But this model describes a synchronized global downturn.
Right.
We just survived a massive inflation spike in 2022, but the world kept growing. Usually if the U.S. economy stumbles, maybe China is booming and pulls the global numbers up.
Or if Europe slows down, emerging markets carry the weight.
Exactly. But a synchronized downturn means there is no engine pulling the train.
Every single major economic bloc is slamming on the brakes simultaneously. The report points out that outside of the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic and the 2008 global financial crisis, this modeled scenario would be the worst synchronized global downturn in 40 years.
Wow, 40 years. But even in a synchronized crash, pain is highly localized, right? The ripple effects hit different shores with different intensities. Like if you're listening to this from a manufacturing hub in Asia, your economic reality in this scenario is going to look vastly different than someone sitting in Texas or London. Let's look at how geography dictates the damage.
Sure. So the epicenter naturally takes the most violent, immediate hit. The Gulf states suffer a staggering economic blow, with their GDP projected to drop over 8% in 2026 alone.
An 8% contraction in a single year. Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of number that collapses governments.
It is a massive localized depression. However, because their economies are so directly tied to the physical extraction of oil, the model predicts they also rebound the sharpest once the geopolitical situation stabilizes.
Ah, because production resumed.
Right, they experience a V-shaped shock.
Okay, now contrast that with the advanced Asian economies, places like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. They don't have domestic oil reserves to fall back on.
No, their entire economic model is predicated on importing raw energy and exporting finished manufactured goods.
So when the input cost of energy quadruples,
And the shipping lanes required to export their electronics and cars are tangled in a logistical nightmare. Their profit margins just evaporate. They face a massive surge in energy import bills alongside catastrophic supply chain bottlenecks.
and Europe gets hit with a devastating 1-2 punch. They suffer the same global oil shock as everyone else, but they also have that localized natural gas squeeze we talked about earlier.
Right, their manufacturing base, particularly in places like Germany, gets starved of the cheap gas it needs to run heavy industry.
So what about the U.S.? The United States is currently the largest producer of crude oil in the world. Doesn't that domestic energy independence insulate the American consumer?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we see that energy independence does not equal economic immunity.
Interesting.
Yes, the model notes the U.S. fares somewhat better initially because it isn't physically starved for raw fuel the way Europe or Asia might be.
The lights stay on.
Exactly. But the interconnectedness of modern finance drags the U.S. down through a different channel, which is wealth destruction.
How so? Walk me through the mechanism of how a pipeline strike in the Middle East tanks the U.S. economy if we have our own oil.
It essentially comes down to corporate profit margins and investor panic. When global shipping costs explode and international markets freeze up, multinational American companies see their profits collapse.
Makes sense.
And the Oxford model projects this translates into an equity market decline of nearly 20% in the U.S.
A 20% wipeout in the stock market. That hits every 401k, every pension fund, every retail investor.
And that creates a massive...
So the global board is flashing red. Inflation is soaring globally to 7.7%. Physical goods aren't moving, and economic growth is plunging. This puts the people who actually manage the money supply, the central banks, in an absolute nightmare scenario.
Oh, they are trapped between two contradictory mandates. It is the ultimate central bank bind.
Because usually if inflation is high, you raise interest rates to cool down the economy. But if the economy is crashing into a recession, you cut interest rates to stimulate growth.
Right. But in this scenario, both disasters are happening at the exact same time, and the model shows the world's major central banks fracturing entirely in how they respond.
I'm looking at the data from the report, and it seems almost contradictory. You have a unified global crisis, yet the European Central Bank and the Bank of England are modeled to raise rates by 100 basis points.
Yes.
For anyone not staring at bond yields all day, 100 basis points is a full 1% increase. Raising rates a full percent while your economy is actively shrinking seems like, I don't know, giving chemotherapy to a starving patient. Why on earth would they do that?
Because they prioritize their institutional credibility on fighting inflation above all else. They look at 7.7% inflation and decide they cannot allow that disease to take root.
Even if the medicine, the higher interest rates, ravages the patient's economic growth in the short term.
Exactly. They choose to crush domestic demand to kill the price spikes.
But the U.S. Federal Reserve reads the exact same global disaster and does the opposite. The model predicts the Fed will cut rates.
Well, the Federal Reserve operates on a dual mandate. They are legally required to manage both price stability and maximum employment.
Right.
So as that 20% stock market crash ripples through the U.S. and companies start laying off workers, the Fed leans into the employment side of their mandate,
So they cut rates to make borrowing cheaper.
trying to stimulate corporate investment and save American jobs, effectively accepting that inflation might stay painfully high for a longer period.
You have Europe violently hitting the brakes and the U.S. lightly tapping the gas. What does that policy divergence do to the U.S. dollar?
It creates a fascinating tug-of-war. Mechanically, capital flows toward higher interest rates.
Right, so if Europe is hiking rates and the U.S. is cutting them, investors should theoretically sell dollars and buy euros to get a better return.
Which would weaken the dollar.
That's the textbook answer. But panic changes the textbook.
Exactly. The counterweight is sheer global terror. In a world facing its worst synchronized downturn in 40 years outside of COVID and the financial crisis, international capital flees to the ultimate safe haven.
Which has historically always been the U.S. dollar.
Right. That panicked, risk-off demand for safety likely offsets the mechanical weakness from the rate cuts, making the dollar's true trajectory incredibly volatile.
And as grim as all of this sounds, the Oxford economics team explicitly outlines how the actual outcome could be materially worse than their baseline model.
Yeah, the baseline assumes the supply chains adapt reasonably well after the initial 6-month shock. But if the physical fuel shortages, that diesel rationing we discussed, prove stickier than modeled, the secondary effects compound.
What's an example of a secondary effect they look at?
A fascinating downside risk they highlight involves the American tech sector, specifically the current boom in artificial intelligence infrastructure.
Oh, right. The AI boom is arguably the single largest engine driving U.S. capital expenditure today. Companies are pouring hundreds of billions into building massive data centers.
But building a data center requires millions of highly advanced semiconductors, most of which are fabricated in Asia.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. If the physical shipping lanes are choked off, or if the 20% drop in the U.S. stock market dries up the cheap capital needed to fund these projects, that AI investment just freezes.
And if the one sector propping up U.S. capital expenditure suddenly hits pause, the depth of the American recession could be far more severe than the baseline 1.4% slowdown.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? If we zoom out from the specific barrel counts and interest rate hikes, we are looking at a scenario where the world potentially faces its second massive global inflation shock in just 4 short years following the pain of 2022.
It's a lot of trauma for the system.
How does a repeated trauma like that change the psychological math for the next decade?
This brings us to perhaps the most consequential long-term finding in the entire report. Economists refer to it as de-anchoring expectations.
De-anchoring expectations. Let's make that tangible for someone trying to, run a business or manage their career.
Sure. Right now, despite recent volatility, the general public and corporate leaders still fundamentally believe that central banks have the power to keep inflation around 2% over the long haul.
Okay.
That underlying belief is the anchor. It keeps behavior predictable. But if we suffer 2 massive inflation overshoots in 4 years, that anchor shatters. The public loses faith in the system's ability to maintain stability.
And once you stop believing inflation will be 2%, your behavior changes instantly. Like if you were negotiating a salary or signing a 3-year commercial lease for your business, you're going to demand a massive premium upfront.
Say 10% or 15%, just to protect yourself against future price explosions.
And when every worker demands 15% more, businesses preemptively raise their prices 15% to cover those new wages.
So the inflation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy baked into the psychology of the market. It embeds a higher inflation risk premium into long-term interest rates globally.
Meaning the entire economic system becomes structurally brittle, highly sensitive, and profoundly vulnerable to even minor future supply disruptions.
It fundamentally rewrites the rules of engagement.
Wow. Let's briefly recap the journey the Oxford economics model just took us on. A localized geopolitical stalemate leads to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. That single physical blockage pulls 20% of the world's oil supply off the market, sending crude to $190 a barrel.
And more critically, it triggers physical rationing of diesel, the lifeblood of global logistics.
Right, goods stop moving. This creates a 7.7% inflation spike, plunges the world into a synchronized recession, crashes the U.S. stock market by 20%, and forces central banks into contradictory, desperate policy moves.
It is a profound stress test that reveals the hidden fragility of our interconnected world.
It is entirely sobering to realize how quickly the dominoes fall.
It is, and this raises an important question, though. The report notes we aren't in this scenario yet, but the mechanisms are very much in play.
Right.
But if we extrapolate this vulnerability, we have to look at our proposed solutions for the future. We talk constantly about the green energy transition, building millions of solar panels and wind turbines to escape our reliance on fossil fuels.
Sure.
But how do we build that green infrastructure? We require diesel-powered heavy machinery to mine the copper and rare earth metals. We require bunker fuel to power the cargo ships moving turbine blades across the ocean.
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought of that.
We are in a paradox where escaping our reliance on these fragile fossil fuel choke points requires massive amounts of energy moving, right through those exact same choke points.
So a shock like the one modeled today wouldn't just cause a temporary recession. It could physically delay our ability to transition away from the very system causing the crisis.
Exactly.
We need the vulnerable system to function perfectly, just long enough to build its replacement. That definitely changes how you look at the evening news. The next time you see a headline about a distant shipping route or a pipeline dispute, don't just process it as political noise. Look at it as a physical vibration in a highly sensitive network that puts food on your table and dictates your retirement savings. Ask yourself how resilient your own industry is to a sudden lack of raw logistics. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive to understand the hidden mechanisms of our global economy. Until next time, stay insanely curious.